Hello, and welcome to the Scope of Things podcast, a no-nonsense look at the promise and problems of clinical research based on a sweep of the latest news and emerging trends in the field and what I think is worthy of your 30 or so minutes of time. I'm Deborah Borfitz, Senior Science Writer for Clinical Research News, which means I spend a lot of time with my ear to the ground on your behalf and lots of hours every week speaking to top experts from around the world. Please consider making this your trusted go-to channel for staying current on things that matter, whether they give us hope or cause for pause. In another 15 minutes or so, I'll be speaking with GCP guru Donna Dorozinsky, editor of a comprehensive good clinical practice reference guide about recent changes related to expectations of institutional review boards, the use of social media for recruitment and communication purposes, and the impact of world events on clinical data management. A sampling of a slew of topics covered in the book being released by Barnett International at this month's Summit for Clinical Ops Executives, SCOPE, in Orlando. But first, my rundown on some of the late-breaking news and emerging trends that have caught my attention, a list that includes a massive health research initiative in the UK, widespread overdosing of trial participants, a vaccine for lowering cholesterol, the growing popularity of phage therapy, a novel scoring mechanism for de-risking trials for chronic diseases, a strategy for making staph vaccines a reality, and the latest oral drugs heading to trials which could eliminate one of the chief barriers to insulin therapy for diabetics. Most everyone has by now heard of the All of Us research program in the U.S. that is building a large and diverse database for informing studies on a variety of diseases and enabling new kinds of individualized healthcare. Well, it turns out there is another program in the UK that at first glance looks remarkably similar. It's called Our Future Health, and it started recruiting volunteers late in 2022. While All of Us is aiming for roughly 1 million participants, Our Future Health already has more than 1 million signed up and is shooting for 5 million volunteers from a range of backgrounds, so researchers can make discoveries about disease at an unprecedented scale. Unlike the US-based program, which started enrolling children at the end of 2023, Our Future Health is only recruiting people living in the UK over the age of 18. A spokesperson for the program tells me that volunteers will be offered personal feedback about their health based on their lifestyle and genetic factors. The approach to sharing back these results is currently still under development, but ultimately individuals at risk for common chronic diseases will be alerted at an earlier stage so that they can take measures to prevent or delay their onset. Participation requires donating a blood sample at a designated appointment clinic, but notably, the locations are convenient and increasingly in underrepresented communities. Our Future Health boasts the largest ever number of volunteers from more deprived backgrounds and ethnic minority groups of any UK health research program. By collecting and linking multiple sources of information at that level, it will be a world-leading resource, helping researchers develop the next generation of personalized treatments and diagnostic tools. Researchers can apply to access the information within an accredited, trusted research environment meeting strict security standards, and a list and summary of all approved research studies will be published on Our Future Health website. Medication adherence in clinical trials is a much bigger problem than I ever imagined, with, in some cases, half or more of trial participants opting to either stop taking the experimental drug, skip a few doses, or secretly take a drug holiday. The culprit is the usual ways in which adherence gets measured, those being pill counting or patient self-reporting. This, according to the folks at the Ardex Group, has led to widespread overdosing of trial participants because sponsor companies have tended to address the problem by selecting higher than needed doses for studies to compensate for deviations from the protocol prescribed treatment regimen. Compliant study participants who take the drug as instructed aren't the only ones being punished here. So too are all the people who later take the marketed drug at the labeled dose and may unnecessarily suffer side effects. One recent study found that up to 1 in 5 drugs on the market are prescribed at a dose that is at least 50% higher than necessary. I'll link to that in the show notes, together with a story about the smart packaging solutions out there that could reliably deal with the issue by recording dosing events via a discrete microprocessor chip to monitor exactly when patients take their medications. Clearly, we need to get our head out of the sand on this one, but and there's always a few buts, not without acknowledging the hurdles with good manufacturing practices that sponsors face in changing up the way they package pills, or how much dosing wiggle room they reasonably have once peak drug concentration has been established, or how at the end of the day, compliance is really more of a human problem than one confined to clinical research. On a more encouraging note, I had the pleasure of speaking to a researcher at the University of New Mexico recently about a 2-in-1 cholesterol-lowering vaccine that is ready to move into clinical trials. What's notable here is that the vaccine appears to work independently of statins. The vaccine targets two different parts of the PCSK9 protein, and in preclinical studies managed to get around the immune system's natural reluctance to inhibit self-antigens made by the body. The technique employs virus-like particles and could be used to prompt immune responses against almost anything, including pathogens and even opioids. Several groups worldwide are now working on vaccines that modulate PCSK9 activity and are already in early-stage trials. The new bivalent vaccine could well be added to the shortlist and escape the notorious Valley of Death, since it has been co-developed with the National Institutes of Health, and a licensing option has been offered to a pharmaceutical company with a decision expected in early March. See the show notes for links to my story about the vaccine and clinical research news, as well as published study results. Thanks to the superbug crisis, bacteriophages, aka phages, are more often making headlines, and perhaps unsurprisingly were named in the top 10 emerging technologies of 2023 report by the World Economic Forum. The University of Pittsburgh's Graham Hatfull tells me that intense interest in phages is likely being fueled by 1. Recent compassionate use therapy reports with favorable outcomes, 2. Big advances in our understanding of phage bacterium dynamics, including CRISPR and other systems, and 3. Phage engineering strategies that enable intellectual property protection and investment. The question now, he says, is whether phage studies and clinical use takes off, or whether this inflection point turns downward again. If you're not familiar with phages, they are tiny ancient viruses that selectively infect specific types of bacteria where they upload their genetic information. Phages straight from the wild have been successfully used to save the lives of patients dying from nasty multi-drug resistant infections. But advances in synthetic biology and genome engineering mean we can potentially progress from using naturally occurring phages to design broadly acting viral-like nanomachines for therapy. Graham says that the health risks of antimicrobial resistance suggests we are now moving into a period when a new Manhattan Project is needed to tackle the technological and biological challenges currently limiting phage therapy while we still have the opportunity. Notably, of the 44 phage-related clinical trials underway with therapeutic intent, 29 have been posted since the beginning of 2020. I'll provide a link to episode 11 of the podcast with Graham in the show notes if you want to learn more about the benefits of phage therapy and the future of phage clinical trials. When it comes to chronic diseases like hypertension, researchers in Australia have come up with a way to de-risk clinical trials with a new patient scoring method that constrains the assessment of polygenic risk to the biology of a drug's mechanism of action, thereby helping to identify the best recruitment targets to improve the odds of study success. In a soon-to-start clinical trial, the so-called pharmacogenic enrichment score will be applied to different classes of antihypertensive drugs. The plan is to enroll at least 200 genotyped individuals and randomize them to different drugs sorted according to how they work on a molecular level, and compare outcomes from the genetically predicted medications to those from the standard of care to see which more quickly and effectively control hypertension. For almost any drug whose mode of action is known and a genetic signal can be teased out, use of the pharmacogenic enrichment score model could be used to direct its use for treatment or even prevention. Yet to be determined is who will help move this forward. Perhaps this is something the R&D collaborative Celebrate will want to throw into the hopper? For more on the current situation with the scoring methodology, including my story in Diagnostics World News, look for the links in the show notes. New hope is also now on the horizon for staph vaccine trials, which have a long history of failures. The key problem all along may have been that the dominant rather than the subdominant antigens were being targeted. While it sounds counterintuitive, researchers at University of California, San Diego School of Medicine discovered that prior exposure to Staphylococcus aureus leaves a non-protective imprint in mice. That is, the infection tends to induce tons of antibodies, but they confer no benefit. So when they get vaccinated, the shot preferentially recalled the bad non-protective antibody response. And in trials to date, the mice have all been caged with little opportunity to encounter staph as people do virtually from birth. Therefore, they responded splendidly to the vaccine candidates, but it was a fool's game. The way forward is with antibodies that target the toxins produced by staph bacteria rather than ones that attack their cell walls. I have a story soon to publish on how a new vaccinology rulebook is needed to outsmart these part-time pathogens, so be on the lookout for that. I'm providing a link to the peer-reviewed paper in the show notes. Finally, a new oral insulin drug is heading into trials that is using nanotechnology to significantly reduce and perhaps even eliminate the odds of patients getting hypoglycemia, currently one of the biggest backlashes of insulin therapy. The secret sauce here is that insulin is encapsulated in a nanocarrier that releases its cargo only when blood sugar levels are high. The biosimilar drug was most recently used in a baboon study that will now be mimicked in a first-in-human study. Academic researchers in Australia, through the spin-out company EndoAxiom, has the support of a biotech incubator to help bring the novel smart insulin platform to the clinic, with the goal of getting marketing approval for the molecule by the Food and Drug Administration, possibly in as little as 3 years, since the performance bar is to be as effective as insulin products already on the market. It is intended for the treatment of both type 1 and type 2 diabetes and uses 1/6 of the insulin dose as Novo Nordisk's candidate drug that was dropped because it was so expensive to produce. Again, see the show notes for more on this front and watch for a forthcoming article in Clinical Research News about the development journey for the oral insulin drug. I now want to pull in today's special guest, Donna Dorozinsky, RN, editor of the 2024-2025 edition of Barnett's Good Clinical Practice, a question and answer reference guide, as well as founder and CEO of Just in Time GCP. Welcome to the show, Donna.
Thanks, Deb. I appreciate you having me.
Well, I'm so happy to have you here today. The new book was no small undertaking, covering all the commonly asked questions and answers regarding good clinical practice standards in 475 pages, now including the areas of managing regulatory inspections, risk-based quality management, impact of world events on clinical trial management, and decentralized clinical trials. So I imagine it is both relieving and rewarding to see it on the shelves, so to speak, hey?
Yes, very exciting. A lot of work from a lot of people went into creating this book.
Yeah, I saw the list. It was like, several dozen people at least?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's dive in here a bit on a few GCP related specifics. Over the past few years, for example, institutional review boards, IRBs, have moved to a single review for multi-site studies thanks to the 21st Century Cures Act and revised Common Rule. And that was a big change. So have we arrived, or do challenges remain around issues of local context and the timeliness of reviews, as I believe was initially the case? Have all the kinks been worked out?
I think things are definitely better than they were. I think the pandemic created an opportunity for us we were forced to fix things, right? The pandemic fixed a lot of things. I think a lot of things happened that positively are influencing clinical research as a result of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And I do think organizations have been able to put process in place to manage to this. I do think that the challenges still remain, especially at the local ethics committee level, right? The smaller IRBs at a smaller institution, and them getting on board with this idea of having a central IRB governing research at their center. But I think predominantly, we're seeing things working much better than they did originally.
Well, that is great to hear. Okay, good. Well, the good news on that front. Another change afoot for IRBs at the international level is a forthcoming revision to ICH E6 related to transparency and sharing of clinical trial results, as well as a fit for approach recommendation for the design and implementation of studies. Can you shed a little light here, Donna? What exactly is ICH E6 and what is being asked of institutions that they weren't already doing?
Yeah, sure. ICH E6, I kind of call it like the handbook of clinical GCP compliance. It's a a group. It's really supported by a large number of the countries: U.S., Europe, Japan. A lot of countries that come together and say, if the data is collected along these standards, we're going to accept the data in our country, right? So it's a standard of GCP compliance, essentially. We are on revision 3. We have the draft version of revision 3, anticipating the final version will come out this year. And what it does is kind of set that standard for quality. R3 has taken, I think, that standard to a new level. Basically, it's taken all of our learnings and really modernizing clinical trials in this post-pandemic technology-driven world. So institutions are now being asked to take that into consideration. You know, we've had the electronic medical record for a long time, kind of what I'll say, beat around the bush as to how we're going to handle it. ICH speaks to what an investigator's responsibility is in terms of electronic patient-reported devices, informed consent, electronic informed consent. Our digital health world that we're living in, it's setting a standard for what is expected of the investigator and of the sponsor and of the IRB, right? The IRB has, we've got electronic images. What does the ethics committee, ethics committee has to look at this if we're doing video recordings, if we're doing video informed consent. How do we manage that from a human subject protection perspective? Mm-hmm. And so this ICH E6R3, I think, is really bringing GCP compliance into the 21st century.
Very good. In social media, we have to talk about social media. It has completely changed the game when it comes to clinical trial recruitment and participant communication, but this seems to still be more of an area of exploration than formal regulatory guidance of any type. Can you point to the key issues and concerns that are prompting, the conversations anyway, and what the holdups are in enacting some guardrails around the use of social media?
Yeah, social media is a slippery slope when it comes to clinical trials.
I bet.
I think there are some really good examples of trials that have really used social media effectively. And then I think there's examples out there of how social media hasn't been so helpful. I think the key challenges are really around ethics, privacy, consenting, confidentiality. And then a big one that I really hadn't thought about until I read an article recently was inequality, right? So one of our key things about clinical trials is we want everybody to have equal access to clinical trials. Yet social media in of itself is an equalizer, I guess, around access, right? Just access, people having access to social media, and then the ability to use social media, especially for the elderly and the under-resourced populations. And if we think about it, the younger generations are using social media differently than the older generations. And so you have to target your recruitment to the age span that you're looking for. And there's so many different social media platforms out there that and new ones cropping up every day, right? Yeah. And so you need to make sure that the media that you're targeting is going to be using it appropriately. And so ethics committees, the review of this becomes really important for the ethics committee. There have been some really good trials that have leveraged social media platforms, I think, very effectively. And so I think that's certainly a signal that we're starting to get our head around this as a society. But I do think organizations are very wary. I know the organizations that I work with are wary to really fully leverage social media campaigns. During the pandemic, there was a lot of social media recruiting around the vaccine trials. I think that really allowed them to reach a very broad population. But I think predominantly we haven't seen that much social media recruitment for such large trials right now. And I think investigators have to think about that, how they're using it at their site to recruit for trials, right? So that they're not just leveraging social media, but multiple aspects to get an equal representation of research subjects.
Yeah, I'm going to definitely be following and listening for any formal guidelines around social media, because I keep hearing it being brought up, but never the end game is known. as of yet.
I think it's going to be a while.
One term that stuck, I was leafing through the guide. I got an early version of it. It talked about internet research ethics. And anyway, the necessity of evolving them basically to consider ethical implications of AI machine learning algorithms, given their use, can introduce bias and issues related to data privacy and equitable representation in studies. Can you elaborate a bit about, who and what is potentially imperiled here?
Yeah. So I think that the future of drug development sits in the AI world. I think as an industry, we are doing a really good job. I know you were talking a little bit about AI in preclinical. I think as an industry, we're doing a really nice job there. And I think certainly in getting drugs to patients, they're leveraging AI to get the drugs to the right people. I think where our gap is in our conduct of the trials. I think there's a couple of factors here. Certainly that around privacy, right? And sharing of how information is shared. I think there's issues around how do we get a large enough database that we can develop the intelligence, right? To then apply that intelligence in the conduct of our clinical trials. We're starting to see some guidance from the agencies around how we leverage AI in clinical trials. And I think companies are starting to invest in it. There is an organization that is pulling together representation from the pharma companies to start looking at how we can leverage artificial intelligence in the conduct of our trials. But I think it's going to be something that probably lags a little bit behind. A lot of people are talking about it, but we're not seeing so many people doing it. And I actually think that's true across multiple industries, right? I think the financial industry has gotten pretty robust, especially around cybersecurity. But I think a lot of other industries are lagging behind. I was involved in a conference with EY recently where they brought just a lot of C-suite executives together to talk about how they're using AI. And they're using it in the financial, they're using it in manufacturing. We're not seeing it so much in the development world.
Okay. More to come on that front as well. Well, so much to talk about and so much to catch up on a year from now. Well, I'm sure we'd have a different story to tell.
I hope so.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. I want to next touch on the impact of world events on clinical trial management, which the new GCP reference book devotes an entire chapter to. At the moment, the Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Hamas war are exhibits A and B here, and I'm sure achieving GCP compliance in the context of those bloody ongoing conflicts could be darn near impossible. Given that, are any trials still underway in those regions? And if so, can you give listeners a picture of how study teams have successfully made do to keep patients enrolled, engaged, and safe?
Yeah. This was when we sat down to do the book, this was something that I was really passionate about, is having a chapter dedicated to this. Because I feel like this is one of our largest challenges today in managing clinical trials for both the investigator sites in these regions, as well as for the sponsors that are trying to manage this. And I think it's not only the countries themselves, but even the regions around the country, right? It's all aspects of the clinical trials, right down to the vendors that are supporting the clinical trials, right? So you may have a site that's open, but if you don't have a CRA that can get to that region, then how do you actually manage that investigator site from a sponsor perspective? So in answer to your question, there are definitely research studies that are still very active in Ukraine, in Israel. In fact, there was a website out there about Israel is open for business in the clinical trial conduct.
Wow.
And so the countries themselves are making an effort to continue to provide this access, this critical access to healthcare, right, for their residents. And I think that both countries have made this a priority. I think where the challenge comes is in the sponsor, right? And I think back to a story that I heard many years ago that's really stuck with me. And actually, Hurricane Katrina changed how we do disaster planning and clinical trials, because literally within 48 hours, we had large groups of research subjects that were not able to participate in trials. There was a phase 1 unit that was located in that area. And so I think the same thing we went through then allowed us to prepare a little bit better for today. And so when we had to pivot during the pandemic, right, research sites got shut down during the pandemic, we had to pivot. Those same principles that we applied during the pandemic, we've applied during the wars that have started. And I think sponsors, it is it is the responsibility of the sponsor to look at their study and look at the risks of their study in the regions that they're in. And when there is a world event, such as happened with Israel recently, they have to take quick action to evaluate the ability to continue the conduct of the study in that region, and then also see if there's an opportunity to transfer those subjects to another more secure region, even if it's within Israel or the Ukraine. I know they offered the research subjects would then move to another location in the EU to do their visits. And so I think companies, sponsors have to be innovative in how they can hopefully continue to provide that level of access for those subjects in that region.
Yeah.
And then the local regulatory authorities have to partner with the sponsors around that.
Yeah, even more so importance of the local folks on the ground, obviously, in that case. Yeah. And lastly, quickly, I don't want to leave this conversation until I ask you about the health authorities around the world, like how well united they are and how to proceed with clinical trials, whether they have to stop, temporarily or permanently, maybe in some cases in these war-torn regions of the world. Are there a lot of differing opinions? And does that add sort of an added level of complexity to GCP compliance?
Yes, I think culturally there's always the complexity of differences, right? But then isn't that, I think in some ways that's the beauty of what makes it successful, right? Is the differences of opinions, the differences in perspectives. But I think in general, our global regulatory agencies are united in the importance of data integrity, data governance, human subject protection, subject safety, right? And I think they all stand united around that. And I think ICHE 6R3 is a really good example of that. Everybody coming together to focus on what's really driving, bringing the right drugs to market. And I think that in that sense, they're very much united.
Donna, you most certainly are a fountain of wisdom. You seem to defy the odds by being a master of all when it comes to good clinical practice. For listeners out there who will be at Scope February 11th through the 14th, you can find Donna at the Just-in-Time GCP booth, number 635 in the exhibit hall, and pick her brain further. Or catch her for a book signing underway at the Barnett booth at 10 a.m. on Monday, February 12th. By the way, you can snag 10% off the cover price during the entire month of February using the discount code SCOPE10. Donna, I am sure we will cross paths at Scope one way or the other, but in the meantime, thank you for sharing some of your GCP know-how with us today.
Thank you, Deborah, for having me. I look forward to seeing everyone at Scope.
Yep, me too. As always, a big thank you to everyone out there for listening in. If you're not subscribed to this podcast yet, please consider going to Apple Podcasts and doing so right now so you don't miss your monthly dose of news and perspectives you'll be hard-pressed to find anywhere else. And if you're up for it, I'd also be so very grateful if you'd leave a rating and review while you're there. For more straight talk on studies involving humans, visit clinicalresearchnewsonline.com. And if you are a clinical research professional, we hope also to see you at our next Scope conference next week, next year, whenever you might be able to make it, where we always make things happen. Bye for now.